I'm going to talk to you today about meetings, business meetings, right from the time that you actually meet another person to group meetings, to business meetings and every other kind of meeting that a corporate individual will be involved in. I will tell you the various things that you should do and you should not do, and the way in which you can create a very good vibe, very good impression, and how you can conduct yourself in a very competent manner as far as a meeting is concerned. The first thing I'm going to talk to you about is how do you shake hands. When you meet a person for the first time, you will shake hands with him. That's the first greeting that you will be involved in. How should you shake your hands? How should you shake another person's hand? How good is your handshake? When you meet a person, should you just go up and shake hands, or is there a particular manner in which you should shake hands? In my opinion, and the best way you can shake hands is, and you should shake hands is, that when you meet another person and you are to shake his hand, you should extend your right leg forward first. The reason is that this gives you greater maneuverability and a much better control of yourself. And then you should extend your right hand to shake the other person's hand. And when you shake the person's hand, it should be web to web. It should be web to web, it should be firm, and you should appear to enjoy shaking the person's hand. You should look the person in his eye and you should have a smile in your face. That would give a very positive reaction. Now we look at various other kinds of handshakes. We would look at the manner in which others have shaken hands and situations which could be really awkward. Now there are several questions which do come up. The first is, should a man or a woman initiate a handshake? There's a lot of confusion as far as this is concerned. Normally and very often people believe that a woman is the person who should initiate a handshake. The reason being that a woman, especially in India, is a lot less forthcoming. She may not want she may not want to shake your hand. You're not really sure whether she will do so, etc. And so unless a woman takes the initiative, the man will not shake a lady's hand. But in a business environment, as you know, there is no differentiation between a man and a woman. There shouldn't be. And therefore it does not really matter whether the woman extends her hand first or the man extends her hand first. The situation is you are shaking hands in a business environment, one person meeting another. It's not a man meeting a woman or a woman meeting a man. The other question, of course, which will immediately come up is who should initiate the handshake? If there are two people, there is a woman and a man, or a man and a man, who should initiate, who should be the person who actually extends the hand? It must be the person who has sought the invitation, who has sought the meeting. If I have sought a meeting with another person and I meet that person, it is I who should extend my hand and say, thank you for meeting me. I am so and so, I am delighted to meet you. The other situation is, and sometimes this does come up, is it all right if you are sitting and a person comes up to you and extends his hand? Is it all right to do so? My opinion is definitely not. Because one, you're not showing enough respect to the other person by sitting down and shaking the person's hand. Shaking hands is a very formal act, and you cannot do this in a very casual manner. The second thing is the person who's sitting down and shaking hands is immediately in an inferior position, because the person who's sitting down looks up to the other person to shake his hand, whereas the person who's standing up looks down. When you're shaking hands, it must be a meeting of equals, not the other way around. And what do you do if you extend your hand and the other person doesn't? You extend your hand, the other person does a namaste, or he doesn't extend his hand at all. What do you do? It's an awkward situation, it can be embarrassing. What you need to do is retrieve your position as fast as possible. If you extend your hand and the other person doesn't, take your hand back or do something else with your hand. Do not make it look awkward and allow yourself to be embarrassed, because that person may be doing it for a specific purpose, to take you off guard. You mustn't allow yourself to be off guard. You mustn't allow yourself to be taken for a ride in this manner. Therefore, you need to make sure that you do something quickly to retrieve your position. Now let's take a picture like this, where you have a situation where a gentleman is shaking hands with one individual with his hand in his pocket and looking at another person. Now that's most inappropriate, because in every aspect it is wrong. One, as I mentioned earlier, when you're shaking hands, it's a formal act. Your hand must not be in your pocket. Secondly, you must be looking at that person in his eye. Thirdly, the person sitting down should be standing up. And fourthly, while you're shaking hands, you shouldn't be talking to somebody else. It's totally inappropriate, and this is something you should not do. There are many other handshakes. Handshaking is a formal act of meeting a person. It's not a fighting game. Therefore, when you're about to shake hands, you shouldn't be pushing your hand in front and hitting a person in the solar plexus. Not appropriate. Nor should you be shaking hands standing and with your hand in your pocket. Again, not appropriate. And your feet should not be together. One foot should be extended so that you get proper leverage while you're shaking the other person's hand. The other situation is sometimes, very often in an office, a person comes into your room, into your office room, and you'd stand up and extend your hand across the desk. That again is not correct, because when you're shaking hands, there should not be any object in between you and the person who you're shaking hands with. It should be directly between each other, and there should be nothing between you. So the most appropriate thing for you to do would be to go around your desk and then shake the hands of that person. Then you would be showing proper respect and proper courtesy. And as I mentioned earlier, another aspect is that if a person comes around your desk to shake hands, you should not be sitting and shaking hands. You should immediately stand up and shake hands formally, because handshaking is a formal exercise. As I recounted earlier, when you're shaking hands, you should extend your hand fully. It should be web to web. Both hands should meet each other. And it should be firm. And you should shake hands twice or thrice, not for a very long period. It is not correct only, and this happens very often, where a person extends only his finger and the fingers touch. That's not a handshake. A handshake is web to web, where your hands are grasped properly. There are many other kinds of handshakes that you do come across. One is when a person holds your shoulder and shakes your hand at the same time. This is intended to show, I am a person who is very friendly with you. He is trying to add an additional amount of, comfort to you. It's sometimes something which a lot of people do. You must be familiar with that. There is another kind of situation where you have a person who, when he is shaking your hand, puts his palm right on top of you. This is known as a dominating handshake. What he is really trying to impress upon you is that in this relationship I'm going to dominate you. Now you cannot afford to allow this to happen. So what you need to ensure is when a person does this kind of a handshake and puts his hand above you in indicating that he intends to dominate you, as opposed to grappling and fighting with him to change the position, you should just move into him. When you move into him, his hand will automatically turn and it will be back to the formal kind of handshake that you are expecting him to make. Do not allow a dominating handshake to overpower you, because then your relationship would be that of a dominating person with a submissive person. Not the kind of business that you would like to develop. Let me summarize some things about a handshake. One, it's the most widely accepted form of first contact. It is no longer a requirement, especially in a business environment, that the woman extends her hand first. There is complete equality in the corporate environment of the sexes, and it doesn't really matter who extends the hand first. What you need to remember is that the person who's initiated the meeting, who has asked for the meeting, that would be the person who extends his hand first. The handshake should not be bone crushing. It should be firm. It should not be bone crushing. Nor should it be weak. A weak handshake is like a wet fish. There's no strength in it. There is no formality in it. It shows you as a weak person. It should be firm, but it must not be bone crushing, because you're not trying to show how strong you are. It's just a handshake, a manner of greeting. We talked about a submissive handshake. Do not allow a dominating person to put you in a submissive position. Always walk in and change the angle of the hand. And a handshake should be for 2 to 3 seconds, not more than that. You're not going to shake a person's hand forever. Although in some cultures a person keeps on holding to the person's hand. That's not necessary. And always make eye contact and step forward, because then you have much better leverage while shaking a person's hand. The other situation that we need to look at is a namaste appropriate in a business environment? What do you think? In India, I believe a namaste is perfectly appropriate, perfectly acceptable. A namaste is a very respectful form of greeting another person. It is a very formal way of greeting another person. And there are many ladies and many others who prefer a namaste to shaking hands. I know in one instance, a very senior corporate executive, a lady, said she prefers a namaste to a handshake because she feels, one, it is a very Indian way of greeting a person. Secondly, she felt it is very dignified. And thirdly, she said, from a hygienic point of view, it's beautiful because you're not actually contacting another person. The other aspect is it all right to bow? In a lot of Eastern civilizations, the Japanese, the Chinese and others, one bows. And you come across Westerners, Americans and Englishmen, when they meet Chinese and Japanese, bowing. Bowing is acceptable in that environment. Similarly, namaste is acceptable in our environment. Now, if you have a Japanese customer coming in to meet you and he is comfortable with his bowing, there is no harm in your bowing. What you're really involved in is making the first contact. You are hoping that that meeting would be conducive, would be appropriate, would be nice. And bowing, if your customer expects it, your guest expects it, there is no harm in doing so. Another is kissing the air. Is it all right to do that in a business environment? Definitely not. In a social environment, depending on the culture, it's perfectly acceptable. The other aspect which a lot of people have difficulty in is introduction. How do you introduce yourself? How should you introduce yourself? Do you walk up to a person and say, I am ABC? Is that appropriate? You meet in a business environment people in conferences, in networking sessions, in another, or when you meet a customer, or you go for a meeting and you need to introduce yourself. How should you introduce yourself? In my opinion, the best way to introduce yourself will depend on the occasion. If you're going to meet a client, they know that you're going to come. And you go to his office, you should of course introduce yourself and say who you are and what you do in your organization. Because then it sets the table, it sets the setting for your further discussions. If you're meeting someone in another environment, suppose it's a conference or a networking situation, what you need to do is, apart from just stating who you are and what you do, you should also add a little more to what you are involved in, so that you can create a scenario for yourself to take that meeting forward, or for that person to raise some questions to you. Suppose you say, I am John Brown. I work in XYZ Corporation. I am the chief accountant. And having said that, you have created an opportunity for that other person to tell you what he is, what his designation is, what he does, and then maybe, since you've also told him what company you are in, raise a discussion on your company or on the organization. Sometimes, if your company is not particularly well known, you can also say what your company is involved in, which creates the background for a discussion to take place and for a meeting to take place and for you to get to know each other better. Another aspect is, how do you introduce one person to another? That's sometimes very difficult, because one is very unsure of how one should introduce one person to another. Now let me take an example. You are sitting with a client of yours in your office. Let's assume that you are the sales manager of an organization, and you have a client who's not necessarily very senior, who has come to meet you to discuss a particular purchase, and your managing director walks in. A managing director, a very distinguished, very well-known person walks in. How do you do the introduction? How should you do the introduction? Obviously, the managing director is a very important person. You are the sales manager of an organization. The managing director is your boss, and here you have a junior executive who's come to purchase things from you. Who gets introduced first? Should you be introducing that sales executive to the managing director, or the managing director to the sales executive? Normally, a lot of people would say the managing director is a very senior, very distinguished person, so I should tell the managing director who is with me. Not so. What you need to look at is, as you are aware, in a business environment, in business etiquette, might is right. And as far as in that situation, what you need to remember is that the customer is more important than your managing director, because the customer is the person who is the reason for your existence, the person who you are selling your goods to, and who you would want to purchase your goods. Therefore, you must say, Mr. Sales Executive, this is my managing director. Then you would tell your managing director, this is sales executive from ABC Corporation. He has come to place an order for 300 widgets. What you need to remember is, it's hierarchy that matters as when you're introducing one person to another. If you're, and to take it a little further, the customer, you will always introduce your company executive to your customer. And it will also be based on seniority as far as individuals are concerned within the same organization. The other is that when you shake hands with another person, how should you respond? What should you do? You are shaking hands with one person. You said, I am John Brown of Widgets Limited. And you're shaking hands with him. What should you say? The traditional statement at the time of shaking hands is, how do you do? And the answer is also, how do you do? However, over time, things have changed slightly. Etiquette cannot be straight-laced. While in formal Victorian England, it was how do you do, with the reply, how do you do? Now, there are many variations, all of which are acceptable. If a person says, how are you? You can always reply saying, I'm very well, thank you, and how are you? To just, to go back to what we actually spoke, when you are introducing yourself, you should speak your name clearly. You must be clear and precise, and ideally, in order to create a discussion base, give some information on yourself. When you're introducing others, you should introduce the younger person to the older person, introduce your company executive to a client, introduce your company peer to a peer in another company, and introduce a non-official to an official person. That's what you need to do, to make sure that everything is clear. You need to remember hierarchy is important. And when you're introducing, you should ideally be standing. Your facial impression should convey pleasure. You should look directly at the other person. There should be eye contact. The pleasantry should be introduced. Always use the full name. It's not correct in a business environment to say, meet John, or Mike, meet John. It's not correct because sometimes it can be very awkward. The awkwardness being that you don't know the surname of another person and you may use it inappropriately. It is always important to introduce a person by his full name. It could be Mike Brown, but you must say Mike Brown. And it's up to Mike to tell the other person, just call me Mike. It's not for you to introduce a person in a formal situation by just calling the person by his first name. And if the person has a title, use the title. It could be captain, major, an army title. It could be commandant, a navy title. Or it could be a doctor. The person could be a PhD or a medical doctor, but use the proper title. And as I mentioned earlier, always add a little information in order to ignite the conversation, to create a conversation. Because then the conversation can go on. The next is, after you meet the person, you would normally give a business card. It helps to give a business card because you need to tell that person, especially in a business environment, who you are, who do you work for, and what is your position. Now let's look at a business card properly. What is its origin? Where did it come from? How did it happen? The origin of the card really came in 17th century England. In two situations. In that, when people went to call on another person, and if that person was not at home, among the aristocracy, among the upper middle class, the tendency was to leave a card with the name of the person in a visiting bowl, which would be in the drawing room. Then when the person who had been called upon returns home, one would see XYZ had called upon us. And then that person would then therefore go and call on the other person to return the call. That is how originally the visiting card or the business card, the visiting card started to inform a person that someone had called upon that person. This developed into another situation in that later on businessmen or tradespeople in England started creating cards which were more like flyers, where they would write their name and say and give their address and their profession, like John Smith, tailor, at 35 Oxford Street, London, or at another particular address. The whole idea was that if a person wanted to go a tailor, they would know then, yes, let me go to John Smith in Oxford Street, and I would know where he is, and in order to get a suit stitched. This, as business developed, people found it very convenient, because the convenience was this, that on a business card, when you gave that card to another person, it had a lot of information. It had your name, it had your position in the organization, it had your address, your phone numbers, your telex numbers, your email address, etc. So on a small card, all the information required for the other person to contact you was there. And thus, it became a very convenient method of passing information to another person, and people began demanding business cards, because if they want to contact another person, it became a very convenient tool. The question then is, what should it contain? It should contain all the information that is required. Not more information than is needed, but all the information that is required to enable a person to contact you. We very often come across business cards, some of them which have mobile numbers and some which don't. In my opinion, a mobile number is also very useful, because if a person's landline is not available and it's an urgent call that you're making, that person would be available on his mobile. But many people argue that a mobile number is a very personal number, it's a very direct number, and they don't really want to put it on their card because they don't want to be disturbed on off times when they're not in the office or on holidays. That's also a very valid argument. So it's really up to the organization to determine whether it should be or should not be. And over time, business cards have also undergone a change to the extent that every person in the organization has a very similar card, which is its standardization, which is very good, because the moment you see a card, you know, yes, this person is from this organization. It would be very inappropriate if every person in that organization has different cards. It wouldn't be correct. The other question is, who should give the card first? When you meet another person, you've gone to call on another person, you've met a person in an organization, who should give the card first? In my opinion, the person who should give the card is the person who's initiated the meeting, who wants to meet another person, who's gone to another office to meet the other person. So that is the person who should give the card first. And how should it be handed over? There are many ways in which cards are being handed over. You have a person handing a card with one hand, which is usually the right hand, or you have a situation where the card is handed over like this, with two hands, with a certain bow. Now, what is appropriate? In the Western world, the tendency is to hand over the card with the right hand to another person, with the writing facing the other person, so that the person can see it. Whereas in the East, especially in areas like Japan, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, etc., and to great extent and increasingly in India, the card is held like this, as though it's a very valuable document. With a certain bow, it is handed over to the other person. Now, here it is, the impression given is this is a very valuable document, and I am giving it to you with a great amount of respect. both these are absolutely okay. It depends on the environment and who you're giving it to. If you're giving it to an Easterner, especially a Japanese, I would say the most appropriate way to do so would be with both your hands handing and giving it with a small bow, because that is the way the person expects it. It is culturally the way the person expects you to hand it over. Whereas in the West, it is just handed over, and that's fine as far as that culture is concerned. What should be done on receiving it? What should you do? When you receive someone's card, the first thing that you should do is you should also return your card. Return the favor by giving your card to the person in the same way. It's sometimes fairly awkward when a person gives it to you with both hands, because you've also got your card, and how do you manipulate between the two? The best way would be, of course, you take the card from the other person and then you hand over your card, as opposed to creating an awkwardness. And the moment you receive the card, the most appropriate thing that you should do is you should look at the card, read it. It's important to read it, and if necessary, even read it aloud. Especially if the person has got an uncommon name or a name you're not very familiar with. The person is from another culture. Because by reading it aloud and then saying, is this the way I pronounce it, helps you to remember that person's name. The person's name, he could be from Africa and his name might be Bambui, or from Japan, or from China, or from even America. You may not be familiar with every single name. So it's usually helpful to say the name, repeat it a couple of times, because it will help you then to remember the person's name and then call him by name later. And ask him if you're correctly pronouncing the name. Because if you're not familiar with the culture, there are always possibilities that you might not correctly pronounce the person's name. Another aspect that you should remember also is that you should not, the moment you get the card, put it away. Because then you are showing disrespect to the person. You must spend a little time looking at the card. If you're at a meeting, you could also even possibly put it in front of you, so that you can repeatedly look at the card and address the person correctly. And there are certain aspects that you should not do when you receive the card. One of the things is, apart from just putting it away in your pocket, you should not scribble in the back of the card. The card is an important document. It's very important to the person who's given it to you. And in front of you, you must not deface it. If you need to write something on the card, maybe the person's mobile number, because his number is not there, or his email number, you should ask his permission before you deface it in front of him. Another is, when you meet a person, you need to respect that person's space. You see, there is a public zone and a personal zone. In a business environment, you should not imagine that you are too intimate with the person, that you intrude in the person's personal zone. You should ideally be around 4 feet away from the person, because that is the social zone in which you should be with that person and communicating with the person, which is around 4 feet between yourself and the other person. If, of course, it's a larger gathering, then the distance may need to be a little further, because there are a large number of people around. But the last thing you should be doing is being in that person's personal zone, which would be around 1.5 feet to about 4 feet, because then you would be intruding on that person's personal zone. And you're not being intimate with the person, you are meeting the person in a business environment.